Good morning and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Phil Prazan, in for Josh Hinkle. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're at the downtown Sheraton Austin Hotel covering the Resurgent Gathering. It's a convention of conservatives who may not be 100% on the same page with the Republican leadership in Washington. Some of the key differences: the way Republican leadership spends your money. Yes, they cut taxes, but they have not cut spending. They're putting millions of dollars on the country's credit card in debt. And then there are President Trump's taxes on trade, known as tariffs, against other countries. I spoke to the main organizer of this event, Erik Erikson. He's a conservative author and activist. He spoke with me from downtown Austin. Why have this event? What's this about?
I'd been approached, having done these in the past for my old website, Red State, needing to have a conservative conference where you actually didn't hear the speeches from the candidates, but actually had conversations with them, particularly as Republicans now in power after 8 years of claiming the Democrats were fiscally reckless. Now the Republicans are. So how do you have conversations with them about the need to not be fiscally reckless and actually stand up for what they claim they support? So
after you and many conservatives worked for years and years to get this power, and here you are, do you think that Republicans in President Trump and also in the House and Senate are using this opportunity like they should?
You know, I don't know that they are. We're going to have $1 trillion deficit for this year. I mean, the expenditure is going to outpace revenue by $1 trillion for just this year. That's not a sign of a fiscally healthy party. During the Obama era, Republicans fought for sequestration to have actual substantive cuts, and they've gotten back in power and they got rid of it. So I'm not sure they're living up to their campaign message.
Why do you think that is? Is it just cutting taxes is easier than cutting spending and they just couldn't do it?
Yeah, I think it very much is easier. I mean, every Republican loves to cut taxes, but how do you cut spending and get it through the Senate with the filibuster is hard. And there really isn't the will for it, particularly in a tight campaign season. No one ever wants to cut spending. It almost makes you wonder if they need a BRAC commission like we do with military bases and have a commission say, this is what you're going to cut. Vote against it if you don't like it. They're largely abdicating their responsibilities there even to bureaucrats as opposed to owning their own powers.
Are your beefs with Washington with everybody involved, the House, the Senate, President Trump, or is there a worse offender in your view?
I definitely think it's across the board. The president isn't necessarily a conservative ideologue like I am. He campaigned on certain things, and to his credit, he's keeping his word, even on things I disagree with, like tariffs. But then you do have Republicans in Congress who have campaigned for years on, for example, defunding Planned Parenthood, which is still getting funded, or cutting taxes, which they've done, but also cutting spending, which they haven't. So where do Republicans and conservatives divide? And also, can we still, even with these divisions, be on the same side against Democrats who we all think would spend even more?
What's your view on how President Trump is doing? I mean, from a viewer, it seems like Republicans are the conservative party in the country, but yet, you know, here's a person who says, I alone can solve all your problems through the executive branch. I mean, that is definitely not giving power back to the states.
Yeah, I think it's a concern. He's done a lot more than I expected, that I've liked. I was not a supporter of his in 2016, and I didn't think he would do a lot of the things that he did promise. He has, to his credit. To his credit, he's kept the promises, though, that I haven't liked as well. I'm really opposed to the idea of the strong man in Washington fixing all of our problems, because at some point a Democrat will be back in the White House. And as Democrats are seeing, they set precedents under Barack Obama that Donald Trump is now using to his advantage. But he's setting precedents the next Democratic president will use that I think is probably a bad idea. Neither side thinks about the long-term problems. They're really interested in the short-term game, and yet they're setting precedents for the other side to use.
So what do you feel like is the role of the conservative movement, or people who want small government? I mean, do they somewhat have to get on the Republican team that is there, or is there some type of opposition from within their own party?
That's one of the reasons for this conference, is where can conservatives hold their own side accountable? It wasn't an issue when George W. Bush was president. Conservatives were allowed to speak out and to complain. With President Trump, there seems to be a real incentive and penalty system within the party to punish conservatives who try to hold their own side accountable. And I think if conservatives don't hold their own side accountable, the voters are going to. So we might as well speak up and say we can do better.
What do you think that the president has done well?
I think the president's done well on judges. I think he doesn't get enough credit on the deregulation front, which has been great for businesses and for individuals. I think he's done very good on the education front, decentralizing power again. But I think he's done bad on tariffs. I think the trade issue is not a good one. I think that there are some foreign policy issues where he's been so distracted by investigations and whatnot, he's kind of dropped the ball on dealing with China, which I think we need a very strong show against China. Not a war, but we certainly need to do better against China, which definitely is trying to build in against us in South America and Central America.
What do you say to the people who are watching this and say, listen, there are two teams in this country. There's the Democrats and Republicans, and you guys need to get on the team, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I would say that's part of the problem we've got in this country is people say you've got to pick one or the other. Well, people are picking one or the other, and those parties are saying, I believe X, and then they're doing Y. And so no one's really being served well in the country. Cynicism in politics is at an all-time high because we've turned it into team sport as opposed to being about conviction. And
what do you think is going to happen in the 2018 midterm elections?
I think Republicans are probably going to lose the House. It's the default of being out of power. The other side is motivated. I think the Republicans will probably keep the Senate. So what can you do as a party when you don't really control Congress anymore? And what should they be doing right now in anticipation of possibly losing the House?
Thanks for your time. Appreciate
it. Thank you.
Erikson's ideas face some skepticism when it comes to Texas politics.
The way that you earn winning is by implementing what you promised to implement when you ran.
How the state's Republican chairman views the divide within the party and how it could play out at the polls in November. Earlier, we spoke with people who disagreed with some of the decisions coming out of Washington, but Chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, James Dickey, says that the debt is not as big a deal because the economy is doing so well, and then the president did campaign on these other issues, and the American people elected him as president.
One of the things I get challenged at the Republican Party of Texas all the time is, which is more important, getting people elected or advancing policies? And my argument is that that's a false choice. The way that you earn winning is by implementing what you promised to implement when you ran. And so implementing those policies and then seeing the positive results of those policies on everyday life is a necessary precursor to then winning again.
And now the Republican president, I mean, the famous line from the convention, or one of them, is look at all these problems and I alone can solve them. Isn't that more executive power?
Well, good, bad, or indifferent. Over the last 20 years, a lot of the most intrusive things that Washington did were driven from the executive branch. That is bad because it shouldn't have happened. It is good in the sense that because it was unilaterally done from the executive branch, it can be unilaterally undone from the executive branch.
You mentioned earlier about the tax cuts that they passed.
Yes.
Then they also came out with a pretty hefty spending bill that really didn't cut the size of government. At face value, it looks like they're just doing the easy thing and not really the hard thing in Washington.
Yes, a big size government is bad, but if you have strong enough growth, you can ultimately end up growing into that. I mean, that's what happened in the 90s. It wasn't only, there were some spending cuts, but the reason why we were able to balance the budget was the strong growth of the size of the economy from the 80s and early 90s. That's what made us able to balance the budget.
So a large government budget is not that bad as long as the economy is going well.
A government budget that stops continuing to grow is survivable as long as we have adequate growth.
Okay.
One that is cut is even better.
How important is Republican Party unity when it comes to this 2018 November election? Because I've heard from multiple people, that I'm going to vote for these people and I'm going to cross over, or I'm going to vote for these people and I don't like this one. Do you worry about that?
People have to realize those individual votes are not really individual votes. Those individual votes change the entire playing field, and so they need to take that seriously. And so one of the things we're doing is spreading the message both about the amazing quality of all of our candidates and the the false assumption that a single vote is just a single vote. It's not. It is a vote for that entire other team, including its leadership.
A couple polls came out this week. Republican candidates are winning in all the statewide races, but the Beto O'Rourke-Cruz race is closer than the other ones, from 2 to 6 points. What do you think it is about Beto O'Rourke, or what do you think it is about Senator Ted Cruz that is making that race closer compared to the other ones where Republicans are winning by 10 points or more?
There are a couple of things. One, I think systemically, this year bears the possibility of being very much the reverse of the 2010 election. So in the 2010 election, President Obama had been elected in 2008. There was a big Tea Party movement, and the Tea Party movement worked together with the Republican Party, and we ended up being able to have a wave election for Republicans in 2010. In 2016, President Trump got elected. There's this whole resistance movement, and there is the possibility of the same kind of inexact reverse.
But should we be taking from those polls that either Senator Ted Cruz is not as good a candidate as the other statewide officials, or that Beto O'Rourke is just better than the other Democrats?
I would take neither, right? It seems like each major election there's one Democrat in Texas who becomes the focus of the hope of Democrats nationwide to turn Texas. So 4 years ago it was Wendy Davis. She raised $39 million. She ended up getting 39% of the vote. And there were plenty of polls during that period that showed that she was doing pretty well, and she certainly was getting all sorts of free press. The same is happening for Congressman O'Rourke, and because he's in Congress and not in the Senate, because the Senator Cruz is in the Senate is hard at work on confirming our Supreme Court justice as well as other justices. So the Senate has zero break over the next 2 months. The Congress, the House, has a 6-week break.
I mentioned recent polling in that interview, and so let's take a closer look at what came out this week.
The November election is less than 100 days away, and new polls are giving us a better idea of how voters feel about the candidates. The Texas Lyceum poll found double-digit leads for incumbents in 2 key statewide races. Governor Abbott holds a 16-point lead over Democrat Lupe Valdez in the poll of likely voters. In the race for lieutenant governor, incumbent Dan Patrick leads Democrat Mike Collier by 10 points. But 28% of likely voters said they still haven't made up their minds who to vote for in November. However, the poll that made headlines was when Texas Lyceum showed Democrat Beto O'Rourke trailing incumbent Republican Ted Cruz by just 2 points among likely voters. The latest Quinnipiac poll gives Cruz a slightly larger 6% lead over O'Rourke. The policies from the Trump White House have not always played well with Texas conservatives, but state leaders are looking for common ground.
Always find ways to cut regulations, to reduce the burden that regulations put on businesses trying to grow.
Why Governor Abbott says the Texas economy is a way to bridge the divide. You're watching State of Texas.
Yes, there is disagreement within the Republican Party, but earlier Governor Greg Abbott spoke today at this convention, and his message was that jobs overrules most of those disagreements.
How do conservatives exist within the Republican Party that's not necessarily conservative, and also work within that party to advance an agenda that lowers the cost of doing business in this country, increases individual liberty in this country, and says that the government that does the least in Washington is the best government, and the best government is the government that is local and close to home.
Texas conservatives tackling how to balance being both a conservative and a Republican.
Thank you all.
Governor Greg Abbott helping to kick off the Resurgent Gathering event, touting record low unemployment numbers statewide.
In Longview, Texas, in West Texas, down in Brownsville, we want to make sure that the wealth is spread, and because of that, we're having record unemployment in every region of the state of Texas. African American unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, women unemployment. You can go through every single demographic group, and there's more Texans with more jobs in every demographic group than ever before.
And part of balancing being a conservative and Republican, finding common ground with the ideals of the Texas GOP and President Donald Trump. Abbott says the state's conservative ideologies have a foundation based on 5 core principles.
1, keep taxes low and cut them whenever possible. 2, always find ways to cut regulations to reduce the burden that regulations put on businesses trying to grow. 3, keep Texas a right-to-work state to avoid the union abuses that you see in some other states. 4 is ensure that you have the rule of law. The last of the 5 is develop a good quality workforce. Employers are coming here because of the high quality workforce that we have.
So it looked like Governor Abbott didn't pick a side on this inter-Republican Party skirmish. He just kind of talked about the things that everybody agrees about.
Well, some of the things that Republicans do agree on, Phil, is the local liberal regulations and the lack of leadership that the Republicans say that some of those local leaders have. You know, they talked about the bag ban, the plastic bag ban here in the city of Austin. Talked about Denton's ban on fracking and how that didn't go over as well throughout the court system as well. So, and they talked about sanctuary cities, something that's a topic across the country, right? In California, here in Texas, and other places too. So there's a lot of those little issues that are not on the grand scale, but they are unifying issues
within the Republican Party.
Governor Abbott also taking Democrats to task across the country, especially in California, saying that the ideals that they have out there do not succeed and will not succeed long term. He said, forget building a wall along the border with Mexico. He said, try building a wall along the border with New Mexico to keep the Californians from getting into Texas.
Let's not forget, half the state does think that the state is broke. Governor Abbott has a challenger, Dallas County former Sheriff Lupe Valdez. Her kind of message on this is that the benefits of Texas don't trickle on to all of Texans. What are some of the issues that she's talking about that these Republicans are not talking about?
Well, something that she, like you say, really wants to focus on is that this state needs to cater to everybody's needs. It is not just half the state or the voting population or the Republicans or whichever group of people. It's everybody whose needs need to be catered. And so, you know, she's talked about immigration. She's talked about the sanctuary cities element to this. You know, so there are some of those key issues that she is looking at. LGBT rights, and so with all of this talk about the bathroom bill, right? Those are some of those things that she is pushing against.
Thanks, Wes.
Thank you, Phil.
I think increasingly there's very little that you can't do over a broadband connection.
Faster, better, and wireless. The new generation of mobile internet has the potential to change the way you get connected.
This is the process of innovation that companies have to figure out a way to adapt their business models to some of the new competitive challenges.
We'll meet a key player from Washington who has a plan to get the new technology out faster.
The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai, also spoke here at the convention. I asked him if he's seen any impacts after they scrapped net neutrality last year.
I think the short-term effects have been that the hysterical prophecies of doom were completely false. People saying that this would end the internet as we know it. People saying that we would not be able to tweet without having to pay a fee. People saying that services would be slowed down or blocked. All of those predictions have been proven entirely false in the 50-some days since we issued our repeal. To the contrary, now what we're seeing is companies finally saying we now feel ready to make these multi-billion-dollar, in some cases, investment decisions to build better, faster, cheaper broadband networks across the country.
He also spoke here at the convention about the benefits of telemedicine and how more and more people are using the tool.
I think increasingly there's very little that you can't do over a broadband connection. Interestingly enough as well, for some of the veterans with more mental health issues, one of the questions I had was, well, do they embrace this notion of not being in the same room as somebody? Because sometimes that interpersonal relationship is critical, especially for a mental health consultation. Interestingly, they told me that the veterans themselves embrace that because for some reason they feel more comfortable sharing a lot of information over that platform. And so I actually think that people are going to, once they get used to the novelty factor of it, it'll become second nature. And so in the same way we all have smartphones now surgically implanted onto our hands, instead of grabbing onto these big wired phones, we're going to get used to seeing doctors virtually instead of in person.
And next year, Texas companies will roll out a 5G internet network in select cities across Texas, and he says it's a step forward.
My views are that we want a more competitive marketplace networks. I personally do not care what technology is brought to bear to get people on the right side of the digital divide. I want all of them to compete. I want satellite companies and wireless and cable and telephone, all of them to have the maximum incentive to build these networks and to compete against each other in the marketplace. That's when consumers are going to be much better off. With respect to 5G, I've seen the promise in the lab in terms of very fast wireless throughput, gigabit speeds over a wireless connection. Look, I mean, this is the same thing when AM radio was in its heyday and FM radio came on board, and then when TV came on board, and then when cable came on board, and then the satellite. I mean, this is the process of innovation that companies have to figure out a way to adapt their business models to some of the new competitive challenges. The role of the FCC, as I see it at least, is not to put our thumb on the scale in favor of or against any particular company or sector of the industry or technology. It's to enable everyone to be able to innovate and let the market, let the consumers, through the aggregated millions of decisions they make, decide what technology works best for them.
But for that recent deal between Sinclair and Tribune that was assigned to an administrative judge, he chose not to add anything else that he said in an original statement a few weeks ago. Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Phil Prazan. Josh Hinkle will be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.